And just in case any of you are not familiar with our work here at GVPedia, here's just a brief introduction. GVPedia is a comprehensive resource providing public access to our gun safety database, which is the largest in existence. And we also have our 200 to over 2,000 academic studies in our study database and access to GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. Both the database and the university are easily searchable by subject and provide excellent resources for educational and advocacy purposes. GVpedia is also home to Armed with Reason, which is our Substack page that next month we will actually be celebrating 3 years of. And today's GVPedia Explains is pretty special because it is going to be based on Devin Hughes's new book. Devin is our founder and president. And the end of last year, he published a book titled The Myths We Carry, An Advocate's Guide to the Gun Debate, which I have here, which I don't know if you can see because my background blurry is on. Um, but I'm just going to quickly read what Devin has on the back of this, and then I will turn this over to him. So, in an age where disinformation spreads faster than the truth, The Myths We Carry, An Advocate's Guide to the Gun Debate offers a concise, evidence-based guide to understanding America's gun crisis. Drawing on decades of peer-reviewed research, government data, and myth-busting analysis, GVPedia founder Devin Hughes distills the key facts every advocate, policymaker, journalist, and concerned citizen should know. So with that, Devin, I am going to turn this GVPedia Explains over to you.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, I hope to speak for about 10 to 20 minutes well, 20 to 30 minutes more likely to give you all like an inside look at the book and then leave hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers. So I am going to share my screen and begin. So basically, what I want to start out with is why did I write The Myths We Carry and why I see this as so important. And through my 12 to 13 years in the gun violence prevention space, one of the things that I've come to believe very strongly and wanted to articulate in this book is that disinformation is a root cause of gun violence. The number one reason why people buy guns today is in the belief that it will make them safer, not only them, but also their families. And the idea that guns make us safer did not arise organically or out of thin air, but is instead part of a decades-long fire hose of falsehood campaign by the gun lobby, which we will be getting into more. And along with this idea that the core disinformation of guns make us safer being a root cause of gun violence that causes people to buy guns is also the idea that ideas themselves matter and that it is important to counter false ideas and promote factual and true ideas out there. And so that's why I embarked on this project. And I started writing about gun violence prevention in 2013 after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. And even at that stage, I had always kind of planned on writing a book, at least at some point. I didn't fully anticipate it to take 12 plus years to do, but in the end, I feel that time was important to bring my thoughts into focus and to really learn ever more about the disinformation campaign and the myths that are so central to the gun lobby side of the gun debate. And so at the very beginning, I mentioned the idea of the fire hose of falsehood. And it a core part at the beginning of the book is defining what a fire hose of falsehood is, why it matters, and how best to counter it. And the fire hose of falsehood is a term that was originally coined by the Rand Corporation to discuss Russian propaganda and how they would weaponize information and use it to attack their neighbors, but also elections in foreign countries, and to really sow confusion for their advantage. And when reading this document, I realized it looked quite familiar relative to what the gun lobby has independently been doing. And the fire hose of falsehood isn't just another name for a disinformation campaign. It's a rather special one. And it has these four key characteristics. It's high volume and multi-channel, so it looks like it's appearing from a lot of sources and a lot of information, or disinformation in this case, is coming through those sources. And so whenever there's a report by somebody in the gun lobby, you'll see it appear over dozens of different outlets. Now, it's all kind of stemming from one single source within the gun lobby, typically, but it has the appearance of many voices saying the same thing, which tends to grant it credibility at a surface level. And the gun lobby uses this to their advantage. It's rapid, continuous, and repetitive. So, along with a lot of information, it's coming out every day, every week, continuously pushing out the same message and just repeating on those same themes over and over again. Um, it lacks commitment to objective reality. It truly does not matter to the Fire Hose Falsehood campaign what the truth is. Um, if the truth somehow serves the Fire Hose Falsehood narrative in a given moment, it'll adopt that. But more often, it'll just go completely at odds with the truth, or selectively cite things and then manipulate those into an alternative reality. And finally, and paradoxically, it lacks commitment to consistency, which is to say that although the core messaging around guns make us safer continues unabated, it's willing to do a 180 on any messaging serving that. So if it's helpful for the fire hose of falsehood to say that crime exploded under the Biden administration, for example, and only started falling due to the heroic, in air quotes, efforts of the second Trump administration, it will say that. If, however, it prefers to say, well, actually, gun violence started falling after the Supreme Court decision in 2022, the National or the New York Rifle and Pistol Organization in New York versus Bruin, and that crime started falling after that, it will say that, even though those two messages are inherently contradictory. Crime can't have been falling and rising simultaneously in 2022. But the fire hose falsehood doesn't care about that, as long as it can preserve something that says that guns make you safer. And the book goes into strategies both at the organizational and personal levels on how to counter this. And most of those efforts rely on what's called inoculation, where it's treating disinformation as a virus of sorts and providing an informational vaccine to people. And I'll be more than happy in the Q&A section to go much further into depth on this, but I want to hit some of the other key elements of the book. So how does the Guns Make You Safer fire hose, adopting those four strategic pillars that it has, um, operate in the gun violence prevention space? Well, one of the first things it does is it suppresses accurate research, whether by just saying that, oh, it's nonsense or liberal bias or these academics know nothing about firearms, um, or going directly to um, the CDC and slashing their budget by the exact amount that was provided for gun violence research and saying that you can't provide any money for projects that might enable gun control. And it was very loosely defined. And in the 1990s, with the Dickey Amendment, the CDC got the message. And so they pulled back on funding gun studies. And while there was still academic research occurring during that period, it was far less than one would anticipate given other fields. Um, while there is a bunch of evidence showing us that, in fact, guns do not make us safer, it's nowhere near the level, say, on like the dangers of cigarettes or drunk driving and other topics that are central to public health. And along with suppressing this accurate research, the gun lobby sought to tout discredited research by a handful of figures. Initially, this was Gary Kleck in defensive gun use. John Lott and the more guns, less crime hypothesis emerged quickly after. And then in recent years, they switched to a professor named William English, whose work was central to recent Supreme Court cases. And in William English case, none of this research was actually peer reviewed. It was largely harkening back to Gary Kleck and John Lott's initial analysis, and was really basically reemerging old themes and using that discredited research to kind of show that, well, both sides have their own research, so you really shouldn't account for that in any sort of analysis, or to confuse people. And that's effort was unfortunately largely successful, where you have kind of a both sides framework from a large portion of the media when it comes to guns, and a lot of, well, both sides have research, who's to really say what the evidence is, and it's all unclear anyway. And that allowed for the gun lobby's broader narrative to remain less challenged than it should have been. And in the end, today from Pew, you have 63% of Americans believing that guns make you safer. And that includes people who don't currently own guns as well. And that can in part explain why there's been a recent uptick in at least interest of purchasing firearms among communities that previously haven't in recent years. And so the gun lobby's messaging narrative has largely seeped into society and is completely at odds with what the evidence actually shows. And it's been this success of a decades-long campaign. And the bulk of the book is focused on this foundational myth of guns make you safer, where it comes from, and what supports this central myth. And there's four key pillars to the myth that guns make you safer. There's the defensive gun use myth. There's the idea that gun-free zones attract shooters. There's the more guns, less crime myth. There's the idea that gun laws don't work. And all these focus on the theme of deterrence and how using a gun is going to prevent bad outcomes. So defensive gun use, this originally came from Gary Kleck in the late 1980s and 1990s, where there was a series of surveys finding around 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year. Now, today we have the empirical evidence from the Gun Violence Archive indicating that there's about 2,000 verified defensive gun uses, and other more credible surveys showing maybe 50, 60,000 at the top end, and also showing that many of these alleged defensive gun uses are likely illegal and harmful to others. And one of the examples I draw on in the book is this story that Mark Bryant, the head of Gun Violence Archive, mentioned to me, where he had seen on one of the gun forums that he looks at to like just see what the conversation is. He saw this story in a Midwestern state about how this older gentleman was out for the evening with his wife going to a movie theater. And after coming out of the movie theater, he saw three guys in hoodies approaching him. And he felt that they were up to no good, and so drew his firearm, and the three guys scattered. And he was proudly posting this on this forum as an indication of a successful defensive gun use. And in a survey of defensive gun use, if they happened to call him, he would have almost certainly said, yes, I did use my gun in self-defense, and it probably saved not only my life, but everybody's lives around me. A couple of days later, Mark Bryant is on a call with the local district attorney of this area. And the DA's like, you won't believe what happened to me last night. So I was going to the movie theater with my brother and his good friend, and all of a sudden this older white guy, and the DA was black, as were his two friends in hoodies. Um, this older white guy drew a gun on us, and we got the hell out of there because we didn't know why he was doing that or what was going on. And so it turned out to be the exact same incident. And so, from the perspective of the older white guy, it was a heroic self-defense use, preventing a crime before it ever happened. Whereas in reality, it was him committing aggravated assault and brandishing a weapon at three people who just wanted to go to the movie theater. And that sort of core distinction really undermines the narrative around defensive gun use. The next pillar is the gun-free zone myth, which comes from John Lott, and you often hear claims of anywhere from 92 to 98% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones, and this idea that shooters overwhelmingly choose to deliberately target gun-free zones for their attacks. And the idea is if that more people carried guns in these spaces, they would deter potential attackers. And the problem with this narrative is that it's based on essentially fraudulent data, that there's this foundational data error in that narrative, and also many of the cases that are cited as mass shooters targeting a place because it's a gun-free zone fall apart the moment you actually read it. And there's far more cases of shooters being concerned about access and finding a good parking lot than actually discussing gun-free zones. And in places where John Lott claims that shooters deliberately target an area because there are gun-free zones, the shooters themselves say that the place they targeted is not a gun-free zone, and there's actually armed security there as well. And so This narrative is more recent than the defensive gun use narrative. It came around in the 2010s, but it's still a foundational myth of this and is cited to not only promote legislation, but also in court cases and to shift the public discussion. Then you have the more guns, less crime narrative, which is combining the direct deterrence of defensive gun use and the indirect deterrence of the gun-free zone narrative to basically argue that more guns and more public spaces is going to lead to less crime. And there was an initial batch of studies in the late 1990s that did find this pattern, but then more and more research was done that found that this pattern was basically an illusion. And more recent academic studies have found overwhelmingly that more guns in public actually increase crime, and particularly aggravated assaults. There's the final narrative that gun laws don't work, and this stems from anything from like background checks to extremist protection orders to child access prevention laws, and not only don't work, but are often counterproductive. There's one common claim out there that everywhere that has banned guns in the world has seen murder rates increase afterwards, which conveniently ignores Japan, which essentially banned guns in the 1950s and saw its murder rate fall by 75 to 80% in the 5 to 6 decades afterwards. And this pattern doesn't just hold for places that ban guns, but like strong permit to purchase laws, cap laws, extremist protection orders, and basically strengthening gun laws while still allowing for gun ownership still can greatly improve public health and reduce gun deaths. So one doesn't need a gun ban like Japan to enact life-saving reforms, but it also shows that at each and every level, the gun laws don't work myth is in fact a myth. And what the facts show outside of the disinformation campaign is that a gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide and triples the risk of suicides. And that's the conclusion of a meta-analysis of around 16 studies that were case control studies. And then there are dozens of other studies finding that this very similar pattern. And there's also a bunch of research showing that strong gun laws that are enforced save lives. Stuff like permit to purchase, extremist protection orders, and child access prevention laws. But there's dozens of other laws that help as well. And you can find those at the Denver Accord. The section that I find the most interesting from an intellectual perspective is, and I devote a chapter to this in the book, is the idea that an armed society is a polite society. And I imagine most, if not all of you, have encountered this talking point numerous times. And what's interesting about this is it's ubiquitous, but where did it come from? And when delving into like the origins of this, it comes from a 1950s science fiction book that describes this economic utopian future society of genetically modified supermen who have everything they could ever want and therefore are extremely bored with life, and so carry guns around and challenge each other in duels. And the reason that this armed society in this fiction book is a polite society is that people need to be very polite to each other, otherwise there's going to be a gun duel. And one of the scenes in the book surrounding this quote is when the main characters go to this fancy seafood restaurant. There's a mishap there. They narrowly avoid one duel, but then get into another gun duel because a different party was found it dishonorable that they had resolved the first gun duel without shooting. And so this is the polite society that's being described in this book. And so the author makes it quite clear that an armed society is a fiction in the work of fiction that it comes from. And yet, through the gun lobby's fire hose of falsehood, it takes this fiction in a fiction and turns it into a bumper sticker slogan that helps support the idea that guns make us safer. And it's just quite interesting how these sort of historical artifacts increase in importance and seek to really sway public opinion. And yet, when you look at the origins, they tend to unravel. The final part of the book is dedicated to solutions. And one of the foundational solutions that really everybody can do is focus on education, um, both of oneself, but also others. Understanding what the myths are, where they come from, why they're important, and what the facts show in each case to help in in-person conversations, to where if somebody's considering purchasing a gun, or is uncertain about a ballot initiative, or is wondering what to do about America's gun violence epidemic, all of that requires education and further inoculation against myths, because it's a lot harder to pass and enact life-saving legislation or a ballot initiative when people think that guns make them safer and that proposed law is going to make them less safe because it's going to make it harder for them to purchase a gun. And so inoculating people against myths is crucial. And this has been found in other controversial spaces that probably shouldn't be controversial, such as climate change or vaccines, or even the idea that smoking causes cancer. Inoculation is crucial in those areas, and it should be crucial in the gun violence prevention space as well. And through this education and inoculation, it allows for and should encourage pushing comprehensive policies and focusing on what saves lives, is shown to save lives in the academic evidence, not necessarily what's the most popular at the moment. And instead of chasing what's the most popular, instead making sure that what saves lives becomes the most popular by shifting public opinion. And we know that public opinion can be shifted because the gun lobby has unfortunately successfully done it over the past 5 decades. It didn't used to be the case that most people felt that guns made them safer, but they do now. And so we know that public opinion is changeable and not this immutable force that we must be bound to. But it also means that we have to try to shift that public opinion. And central to that project is education and inoculation. So with that, you can find my book on Amazon. I also do have author's copies if you're in the DC area that I can provide. And if you have already bought my book, thank you, number one, and to please rate and review it on Amazon. And the book itself, as was held up earlier, is deliberately pocket sized. To be fair, it does require a decently large size of pocket, but can fit in a handbag or backpack easily as well, and can be read in the space of an afternoon. A lot of the writing and work on this was actually what not to write, because each of the chapters in here could itself be an entire book, but providing, hey, what's the most crucial information that can be readily understood and then um, used to used in conversations with others. And if somebody is interested in a more in-depth, like book-sized version of all this stuff, you can look at all our articles on Armed with Reason, as well as GVPedia.org itself. So with that, any questions?
Thanks so much for sharing all of that, Devin. And Shannon and Eric dropped the links below in the chat for anyone who's interested in purchasing the book or checking out our Substack. We do have a couple of questions from individuals who RSVP'd. The first is about a scenario of a representative who was at a UNH town hall last week and started speaking about some myths related to successful self-defense shootings. This representative stated that over 35% of shootings are made in self-defense. Let's say that's something that somebody says to you directly, or you're in a meeting around a table with some elected leaders and somebody makes that comment. First, is that true or not? And second, how would you go about addressing that?
Yeah, so it's not true. And it's one of those, it's a distortion of the myth that it's based on as well. And so if this were to come up in like a personal conversation or something, like kind of my initial response would be, well, that's an interesting point. Like, where did you find that? And like, how did you come up with that? What's the source? I'm interested in hearing more about this, because there's this thing in the literature called the illusion of explanatory depth. And what that means is that people in general, and this includes myself, everybody here on like subjects that we're not terribly familiar with, we tend to think we know more about the subject than we do. And so when we come up with something, if we're asked about it, then we're like, oh, we have to go back and find like, well, where did I actually find that? And do I actually know as much about this topic as I think I do? And it turns out when people are engaged in that, they become more moderate and also willing to explore different information. So in a personal conversation, the best thing is not to go, you're wrong, and then whack them over the head with a textbook of statistics, but to engage in that narrative in trying to find the truth together. Now, in a public setting, like a lawmaker proposing a law and bringing up this talking point, um, it's you're probably not going to have the time to, in that public space, engage in a personal conversation with the person. So it's important to go to the statistics there to make sure that these aren't challenged. And where this myth likely comes from, though, like given the lawmaker is making a mockery of the original mockery, like it could be something else, but there's this myth from John Lott about active shootings, and that more than 30%, and can even go as high as 50% of active shootings are stopped by a quote unquote good guy with a gun. And this is directly at odds with the FBI's own finding on active shootings that found it was around, I want to say 4 to 6%, like at the highest. And what the reason for this like 30 to 50% versus 4 to 6%. And where that comes from is that John Lott did this analysis where he basically starts adding a bunch of um, incidents that are not active shootings. So, for example, road rage cases, which the FBI deliberately does not count as active shootings, or cases that occur in public where only one person is being targeted. And then Lott goes through and only adds the cases in which there was a successful defensive gun use and puts that on top of the FBI cases. And this has the effect of greatly increasing the number of defensive gun uses while not increasing at all cases outside of what the FBI considered. And this can be particularly seen with road rage incidents where Lott has, I believe, 7 road rage cases where there's a defensive gun use and 0 that didn't. Yet when you look at the statistics on the gun violence archive, you'll find there are 7 defensive gun use cases out of around 3,000 road rage incidents. So Lott doesn't include the 3,000 number and add those onto the active shooting cases, but he does add the 7. And so this just completely botches the entire exercise and conclusion, but provides a useful narrative for those seeking to advance the guns make you safer myth. And then, and part of the thing as well is that the fire hose of falsehood, given its lack of commitment to any sort of central truth, even relative to the myths itself presents. It's perfectly fine for fire hose of falsehood to cite oh, 30% of all crimes or stuff are stopped by a defensive gun use. There's even talking points out there that there are more defensive gun uses than crimes committed with guns. But all of these talking points kind of just go around, emerge in a fashion that is multi-channel, repetitive, appearing all over the place. And if you're not aware of the origins of these talking points, it's going to appear like a perpetual game of whack-a-mole. It's like, hey, this talking point popped up over here, another one popped up over here, and you might never come to the case that oh, these all stem from this one core myth and it's just being distorted. And that distortion is part of the fire hose of falsehood tactic itself. And so hopefully that answers that particular question.
There's a question here in the chat recognizing the tobacco industry, stating the tobacco industry was once nearly as strong as the gun lobby. Have you done research into looking into how the tobacco industry's lies were eventually defeated?
Yeah, so one of the key things with the tobacco industry was that there was the research that overwhelmingly showed that tobacco and smoking tobacco caused cancer. And that research was built up quickly and rapidly. And while the tobacco lobby had its own paid scientists basically to try to argue otherwise, there is a strong campaign there to elevate the research quickly. And part of what makes the gun violence discussion different from the tobacco discussion is that the burgeoning research on gun violence was kneecapped rather quickly with the Dickey Amendment. in the 1990s, and which extended through to like 2020 and beyond. And so there wasn't a chance for a like snowball of research to accumulate um, on the topic, and allowed for the relatively small handful of gun lobby chosen academics to produce an amount of research that looked at least like, oh, there's two sides to this. Whereas in the tobacco case, the research showing that tobacco does cause cancer gained an overwhelming advantage rather promptly. And then there was the coordinated push and campaign to highlight, like, hey, this is a disinformation campaign put out by the tobacco lobby, um, highlighting that, making sure to push out the research that showed that tobacco causes cancer, and then getting institutional buy-in on that to where now you have like warning labels on cigarettes and everything going forward. But basically, gun violence hasn't achieved the step one narrative dominance on the academic evidence that allowed for the tobacco or the campaigns against the tobacco companies to be successful. So that's kind of the main difference there.
I see John has a question here. John, you want to hop on and ask Devin? We have about 10 minutes left.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, Devin.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I hope this doesn't sound like a shameless plug, but I'm going to say GVPedia has been a blessing to our efforts, continues to be. And as we reach out, our network's about 400 plus colleges and universities. There are two books now that we're actively, obligated to promote. And one of them is Our Nation Under Guns by Dominic Erdozen, who's a professor down at Emory. Fantastic deep dive into the culture and the historic assessment of how we got here. And the other is The Myths We Carry. Your book is just so important for the kind of rooms we find ourselves in. So thank you. This is what I'm coming across, which is a challenge. It's one thing to be kind of on the stage of the back and forth ping pong debate side of discrediting falsehoods and myths. It's another when people say it's not about you beating me in the argument of the data or the proof, it's how I feel. And I believe that the gun lobby's done an exceptional job of winning that war psychologically, that if I feel that this is going to make me safe, and I believe that it's my inherent right, losing the argument on an intellectual side is not of my interest. They've already kind of locked themselves, and I'm hearing that from this representative up in New Hampshire. He has no interest in debating on the details. He's got his talking points about his rights and what makes him feel that they are protected. So I think we have a lot of homework to do on that side. But my question is more specific in terms of what do you make of the movement to bring curriculum, firearms instruction, education, and curriculum into schools, uh, also positioned in a public safety narrative. But when you kind of peel the onion, you find out, and they're on record, that this is about indoctrinating another generation into their gun rights. And so I'm wondering, if that's also something we have to be aware of, is not just the arguments, but the mechanics of where they're applying this narrative. And on a more macro side of that is universities that have very well established, proficient firearms research centers, from Duke to Rutgers to Michigan, We just noticed that the University of Wyoming opened up its first firearm center, but it looks nothing like Duke and Rutgers in Michigan. It's all narrative. It's all about propagating, you know, what's considered to be Second Amendment rights and duties. So, yeah, that's my question to you is the organized methods that are in play right now to get right into the schools and universities with the myth.
Yeah. So I'll kind of take both parts. So on the emotional side, like I think it's important to recognize that for that specific legislator, you're highly unlikely to change their mind. And that's kind of like not the point. When you're going on some form of debate stage, and I do feel it's important to show up, it's more of a like to prevent further dissemination of bad research and myths because the fire hose of falsehood basically gets an automatic win when we fail to show up. And so you might not be convincing anybody in a debate, but at least you're mitigating the damage. Because if you don't show up, like they'll find somebody else who isn't necessarily as versed in the stats, or the pro gun side will just be able to spout their talking points for in a presentation instead. So it's important to show up and meet the fire hose of falsehood with the fire hose of truth. On the emotion side, I think there's a key distinction between the emotion of I feel unsafe and then what do I do about it? Because we can't really challenge the narrative of I feel unsafe. Like that's deep rooted in our psychology. Um, like if you have somebody, like to take a most extreme example, like having a panic attack or like just in the throes of being scared, or like say like watching a horror movie and somebody's like curled up and frightened and you're just like there's no reason for you to feel scared or unsafe, like it's just a bunch of pixels there, or telling somebody in the midst of the panic attack like this isn't real, just calm down. Like never in history has that ever stopped a panic attack. Nobody goes like, oh, you know what, you're right, I'm going to stop having a panic attack because I realize that it's intellectually foolish. Now, when it comes to like feeling unsafe, like we have to recognize that's valid, but then to open up, all right, what to do about it? Because those are two separate things. And it's like, all right, you're unsafe. So what can we do about that? And people are like, well, I want to buy a gun. It's like, okay, do you think like, is that actually going to accomplish your goal of being safer? Have you explored these other options? Have you seen the stuff where a gun will actually make you less safe versus these other options and by itself will make you less safe? If you do decide to buy a gun, here's the ways that to mitigate the degree of danger through safe storage, proper training, de-escalation. And because one of the things that the gun lobby's been quite successful is that it's like, oh, you buy the gun and then it's like a magic wand sort of thing. It's like you're safe, you don't have to do anything with it. It's a one and done sort of thing. And to get people out of the headspace of like, oh, it's just I buy the gun and then I'm safer. It's like, no, there's all these other factors and stuff, and adding more barriers to entry, basically, to where it's like making sure people realize in order to be as safe as possible with that gun, you would need to do this, this, and this. And there's all these other alternatives that are going to be more effective at keeping you safer and not have the additional danger of the gun as well. So, not challenging the fear, but to go through and like, what's the most effective way to help with that fear? And I do strongly feel, and I've had this in conversations as well, that like once you kind of break that down, sort of thing, people are going to be more open to like, oh, here's this solution to my fear that's better than what I was initially thinking. Uh, because, and we know this can work because the gun lobby itself did it, because most people didn't used to think that a gun made them safer. They didn't go to the gun initially. Like that was like the fear-based response was going to something else rather than to the firearm. Like the fears were still there. So why did they choose the gun? Well, because all of these ideas have come down through various forms for decades to associate the fear, get the gun. Now, for the second part, I realize we're probably running low on time here. Yeah, for gun like gun-based education at schools, like it's really, really tricky because most of the time it's just an effort to be like, hey, guns are awesome, and here's how to like handle the gun, and here's what the gun parts are called, and isn't this great and fantastic? Versus like having like, hey, like having it be more like how education around cigarettes is treated, or hopefully in most schools, global warming and um, topics where there is a settled um, consensus. And so it really, really depends on like the particulars of the educational program. And if there is going to be an educational program, making sure that's like, hey, there's something talking about these myths to where the myths don't go like unchallenged. So particularly in like red states or even purple states where like if they're saying we want an educational program on this, first it's like probably not, but if so, like, all right, we want this, this, and this in here to be exposing people to like what the academic evidence actually is, like what scholarship in the educational system shows about these and what the myths are and how those matter. So really pushing for that. And then if there's pushback, like, well, we don't want that, it's like, well, why don't you want the truth being taught in an educational program, sort of thing. But I think at each of those levels, it's important to at least be at the table on them to push back to where the fire hose of falsehood doesn't get a win. And it's kind of, and it also stems back to the fear-based conversation as well, where it's like we should be able to be clear in our messaging that like a gun in the home does not make you safer. But if you choose to have a gun, here are the steps that you should be taking to be responsible and as safe as possible with it. Like it's not an either or, it's like a both and to have that multi-step conversation or approach to where it's like the best case scenario is this, but if that best case scenario isn't arrived at, then proceed with the following.
Devin, there's a question in the chat here from Jen Reed that I think probably deserves a longer answer. So I copy and pasted it and I'm going to email it over to you so the two of you can have a conversation about that. But I did want to say that the question is, it's how should researchers be working with advocacy organizations and communication professionals to frame our work so that it's effective at countering misinformation? And next month in April, GVPedia will actually be releasing a report on disinformation and different ways to combat it depending on if you're an advocacy group, if you're academics, if you are working in communications or journalism or what have you. So it is the first step, I would say, in this disinformation journey that we're all on. So Jen, just keep a lookout on your email because that again, that will be coming out next month, and maybe we'll give you a little more in-depth details in addition to whatever Devin will be able to respond
Yeah,
to you with.
so the high level thing there is I think the inoculation approach is crucial because you're correct that just like our facts versus their facts and air quotes, like at best leaves this keeps the status quo. But what researchers have found in other spaces, and you can read this on our Fire Hose of Falsehood report on GVPedia, is that when you um, have people like in a controlled, safe setting and expose people to the disinformation, tell them that it's disinformation and here's why it is, basically pre-bunking, that can be extremely effective at countering. So it's basically getting in before people encounter most of the major disinformation. And then, like, if they have encountered the major disinformation already, basically go through the, like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that? And kind of expose the illusion of explanatory depth. And I think one of the bigger things that researchers can help do is make sure that, like, one, present the research in an approach that, or like in a style that advocates are going to be able to make sense of, to make sure that the research is like directly answering like a key question that advocates have. There's a lot of research in the gun violence space that isn't necessarily directly applicable to advocates. And there's also tends to be the problem of paywalls, where like you can have the best journal article ever, and it's going to cost you $50 to read it. Uh, and if it's going to cost you $50 to read it, it's not going to get read. Um, so there's also that kind of gatekeeping that needs to be found a way around, and that can really only happen at the academia level, and then just like providing those resources in a way that can be used. And then finally, like studying disinformation itself. There's been this trend in academia where it's like, oh, John Lott was debunked in the 1990s along with Gary Kleck. That's irrelevant, even though John Lott has had more influence than basically any other scholar, which is like extremely galling to say, but is the case. Despite being officially debunked like decades ago, he is still cited um, like at the highest courts for pushing legislation at the state and national level, etc. And so it's crucial to, even if you think that disinformation has been debunked for decades, the fire hose of falsehood doesn't care and is continuing. And so having research on disinformation, why it spreads, and treating disinformation as a root cause of gun violence rather than a sideshow, I think is probably one of the most important aspects. So that's my 60 seconds response. I'm happy to provide a longer response in email if you would like.
Yes, I've passed that along to you, Devin. Well, it is a couple minutes after 1, and we want to make sure everyone can get back to whatever else they have planned for this spring day. So thank you to everyone for coming to join us, for spending this hour here with Devin, learning about his book, asking great questions. And there are links in the chat again in case you would like to purchase the book, or if you are in the DC area, Devin would be happy to get a book to you. And yeah, Devin, congratulations on this big achievement, and thank you for all that this has added to the conversation and to the movement for gun violence prevention. It's definitely a really valuable resource that we have. So you did a fantastic job. All right. Have a great day, everybody.